Hi there, this is John Moore, and I am a shamanic practitioner and teacher. I live in the state of Maine in the US, and today I want to talk to you about how to do shadow work on yourself. I'm going to touch a little bit upon what the shadow is, why it's important in spiritual work, and how to begin doing shadow work on your own. And first of all, so you probably have heard of shadow work if you found this video and clicked on it or you're curious about it. My belief is that the most important work you can do is on yourself. And the most powerful, the deepest work that you can do is on yourself. Yes, you can work with a psychoanalyst, you can work with a therapist, you can work with a shaman, you can work with other types of healers that might do shadow work with you. But really, the work, as with lots of types of therapy, is going to be on your own. So let's touch on the concept of the shadow and what the shadow is and why it's really important to do shadow work. Particularly, it doesn't matter who you are, but particularly if you do any kind of spiritual work, the shadow is going to rear its ugly head. I almost hate to say that, but the shadow is going to rear up. So the term the shadow is coined by psychoanalyst Carl Jung to indicate parts of ourselves that are in our unconscious. They're also known as exiled parts of ourselves. Why are they exiled? Why are parts of us in our unconscious? One of the biggest reasons for that is shame. We have parts of ourselves that we're ashamed of because our culture tells us they're wrong, our parents told us they're wrong, our education told us they're wrong. And for a survival mechanism that humans have is to gather and to be part of a tribe, right? And so if we think that parts of ourselves will be unacceptable to the tribe, more or less, then we're going to hide them away, right? So that's in the shadow. What else is in the shadow are our wounds, our psychological, psycho-spiritual wounds that we have deemed too painful to look at, too painful to remember. So an example might be some sort of abuse that happened during childhood that we don't really remember. We've locked that memory away. It doesn't mean these things don't affect us. They're still there. They're still affecting our lives. They still crop up, and I'll talk about how that happens in this talk today. The other thing, so we have the parts of ourselves that we've exiled off. These include our wounds. I talked about that. Hidden desires. We all have hidden desires. We all have things that are like, oh, I can't talk about that. These could be anything from the obvious one is sexual desires, right? So you may have sexual desires that you've hidden away because you've been told or taught, or the culture has enforced that they're shameful or that you're wrong for having them. Okay. These could be life desires. These could be things like, I always wanted to learn how to play the piano, but my parents told me it was a waste of time, or whatever. So hidden desires of any kind can be a part of that, and they can certainly come up and do that. So things that we don't like about ourselves. So instincts that we have that we don't like about ourselves, and these can be really powerfully protective mechanisms that we have. So for example, I get angry about this and I don't want to think of myself as an angry person, so I hide that part of myself away. But that anger is still there. It's still under the surface. So what's the problem then that the shadow presents to us? And why was Jung so interested in the shadow? And Jung, I'm going to paraphrase Jung when he said, you don't reach enlightenment by seeking more light. You reach enlightenment by going down into the shadows and making that material conscious, right? You can't be a fully actuated person. You can't be living in your own sovereignty when there are unconscious parts of you that are running your life. And these unconscious parts of you are running your life. We just don't see it because they're unconscious. But one great example of, or, not a great example, but one example that's very clear about how the shadow can run our lives is when we get triggered, when we have an overwhelming, disproportionate emotional response to something. And frequently people, where did that come from? Somebody cut me off in traffic and I felt like I wanted to go punch him in the nose. Or, somebody forgot my birthday and I got depressed for a week. Or, where does that come from? Because logically we could just say, well, that guy was a jerk, we'll just let him go. But sometimes people get enraged about these things, or they get triggered, or they get overly upset at stimulus. This comes from shadow material. So shadow material, a metaphor that I like to use, it's like pushing a basketball underwater. You can go so far, but it's going to pop up, and you don't always know where or when it's going to pop up, but it is going to pop up, and it's going to influence. A lot of the influences on our decisions are unconscious. So the decisions we make in our life, the things that are, avoiding risks that might actually be good for us, or not living in our full capacity, not exploring our gifts. The other way that the shadow can be a really ugly part of ourselves happens a lot when you see people who reach certain levels of spiritual development who haven't also done their shadow work, that haven't done their cleanup. And my cat, speaking of shadows, here's Phoebe. Phoebe, say hello. She has decided she wants to be a part of the action today. Hi, Phoebe. She's my shadow. She follows me around the house. You'll see people reach a certain level of spiritual development, and then the controversies will happen. They will, it'll come out that they're have been abusing their followers, or get into legal or financial trouble, or something will come out. And I know, personally, I know a spiritual teacher, this is from decades ago, who, everybody thought that, this guy's enlightened, he's, whatever, who wound up taking his own life. I know spiritual teachers who basically drank themselves to death. So if you can develop an amazing amount of spiritual insight and have even things that people would consider powers, right? Like magical powers, whatever, and not have done your cleanup work. Now, you're never going to go as far as you could go if you haven't worked on your shadow. But what happens as we do our spiritual development and we gain a certain amount of power, whether that's charismatic leadership over a following, or some sort of super, quote unquote supernatural powers or whatever, is that our when our shadow acts up, it can do so in really damaging ways. It can really harm other people. We can harm ourselves. All of these things. So if you've ever had behaviors that you're like, that wasn't like me, or reactions to things that are, where did that come from, or desires that you've had to tamp down for whatever reason, that's your shadow. And we all have it. We all have it. Nobody is without this, because none of us grew up without the influence of culture, media, parents, education, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So now that we understand the shadow, now that we understand what it is, now that we understand why it hampers our spiritual development and can be dangerous at higher levels of spiritual development, what do we do about it? How do we begin to do our own shadow work, or do shadow work on ourselves? The biggest part of shadow work is just understanding what's there. right? And we can do this through self-observation and self-inquiry. And I highly recommend getting yourself a journal, a good size. This one hasn't been unwrapped yet, as you can see. Getting yourself a good sized journal that you can, hide away, lock away, whatever you need to do, because this is going to be private for you. And it's really, really important that this is private, because you're going to be writing a lot of like really inner things in there. And I will do a whole separate video on prompts for shadow work journaling. But and I'm not a big journaler. I'm not one of these people who writes Dear Diary and every day and that sort of thing. But it is important to get this information out of you. And if you're doing work on yourself, the best way to do that is in journaling. And I actually think writing on paper is different than typing it up in notes or speaking into a recording or anything like that. So I highly recommend writing things down. Keep your journal private. Lock it up if you have to. So here are some of the things we're going to start to write down in this journal. This will just bring our shadow aspects to light, and that alone begins the shadow work that you're going to do on yourself. So you're going to journal, what are my hidden desires? What if there was, nothing to stop me, and even take moral aspects off the table, right? So maybe I have a desire to go rob a bank. Well, I would never do that, right? I don't have a desire to rob a bank, but let's say that was my hidden desire. I want to go rob a bank. Write that down. Even if you would never do that, take away what are anything stopping you, any practical things, what are my hidden desires? I would like to be able to fly, right? Like Superman. That would be a great thing that I could do. But I can't, like physically, that's impossible, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's impossible or not moral or not ethical. It's a desire that is inside of you. Write it down, because what we want to do is we want to start to get to the root of these things. Where do these things come from? Well, maybe my desire to fly like Superman is a desire to escape, a desire to be free from certain circumstances. Where did that begin? Okay, so write that down. So we'll start with hidden desires. The other thing to journal, the other thing to log, and I spent a couple of months doing this at one point, and it's something that I go back to from time to time. Anytime you get triggered, meaning you have a disproportionate emotional reaction that seems to come out of nowhere to something, anytime you get triggered, write it down. Write down the date and time, what happened, and what your response was to that. And over time, depending on how often you get triggered, over time you will see a pattern. Oh, I get triggered every time someone has been disrespectful to me in some way, or has talked to me like I was stupid. Or that was a big one for me. Somebody treating me like I was stupid was a big trigger for me. Why? Where does that come from? Most of the time, that stuff is going to come out of childhood. And we don't have to remember trauma to heal from it. That's an important thing to remember. Now, at a certain point, when we're talking about our desires, we're talking about our triggers, and triggers are pointers back to wounds that we still have. There might be this feeling like, okay, this stuff is meant to be in my shadow, because if I bring it up, I might act on it. I might become a bad person, right? If I have hidden desires, I want to rob a bank. I want to punch the guy in the face who cut me off in traffic. I want to do this. I want to do that, right? Those things, you are not going to do those things. Why? Because you still have ethics. Bringing this stuff into the light doesn't mean your ethics go away. It doesn't mean the things that you have learned in your prefrontal cortex, your ability to interact with other humans, your ability to discern, those don't go away. Okay? It's not a Jekyll and Hyde thing, right? Where you're going to become Mr. Hyde and go crazy and go nuts and become, violent and, have all kinds of sexual impropriety and, whatever. Sexual desires are a big link in here, and one of the things, our sexual desires are often linked to stuff. Not often, almost always linked to stuff in our past, even stuff from childhood, especially stuff from childhood. So, why why do I have certain desires? Why do certain things come up for me? What are these patterns? So journal that stuff, okay? Even if it's something you would never do or can't do for whatever reason, it's illegal, it's immoral, it's whatever, write it down, bring it up, bring it into the light so you can start to integrate the hidden parts of yourselves. The other another really big indicator to what's in our shadow is look at things that drive us crazy about other people. What is it that other people do, say, or there are characteristics about other people? Maybe there's a physical characteristic about another person that drives you crazy and you don't know why. I get upset about people with big noses. I don't, but as an example, I don't like, big noses really, set me off. There's something about that. What that is there's some link to something, and you may never get to the incident or the whatever, and that's fine. You don't have to remember trauma. You may have been traumatized by somebody with a large nose, or your parents had were in an argument with somebody with a large nose, and you sided with them because it was protective. The shadow is a protective mechanism, and we need to understand that. So what things drive you crazy about other people? Write them down. Do you have pet peeves about what people do or what people look like? Write that down. Even if it seems like we all have hidden biases, right? We all have what's called implicit bias, which means we have bias that we don't even know we have. Understand that, and give yourself compassion because you are a human being. And I'll talk about compassion and self-compassion and self-love in a second. So, stuff that people do that drives you crazy. The other thing to start journaling about is what memories from childhood really stick with you. And in this case, again, it's not my goal to re-traumatize you. You don't have to pull up traumatic memories. But are there things that stick with you? When I was a kid, when I was little, for example, I remember being in the ocean with some relatives, and the waves coming in and out. There was an out current, and getting sucked under the waves and not being able to come back up. And then my uncle reaching down and grabbing me and pulling me up out of the water. That has stuck with me because that was frightening. It was, life-threatening situation for me, even though it was a few seconds, right? And I might have been 4 or 5 years old, and I'm, in my 50s now, and I remember that clearly as if it were yesterday. That has stuck with me, right? So that's something I would write down. And, that kind of thing. What things have really stuck with you? Okay. So once you start journaling these things, you're going to have revelations about yourself. You're going to be, pay attention to how you feel. Oh, I write down this desire. It makes me feel a little queasy, or it makes me feel ashamed, or shame is a huge indicator of shadow material, right? We often push things into the shadow because there is shame. So this is the part where I talk about being in self-love and self-compassion. So you need to understand, the few things you need to understand are that we all have this stuff. Every human being, all of the billions of human beings on this planet and the billions of people who have lived on this planet in the past have had a shadow and have had very similar things. So you are not alone even if you feel that way, okay? You are not broken, you're not bad, you're not wrong. This is part of the human experience. And if you're doing your own shadow work, you are seeking to evolve. You're seeking to be a spiritually evolved human being, and you should feel good about that. Second of all, shame is toxic. So feeling like you're broken or bad for things that are naturally human. Hi, Phoebes. Hello. Hi, Phoebes. Phoebes does not feel bad about interrupting any videos at all. She, even when I have clients, she'll jump up in my space. She likes to be the center of attention, don't you? And so, which is fine, right? No shadow with a cat. She just is what she is. She's like, I'm just gonna come over here and get some attention. Which is totally great, Phoebes. So anyway, you have to treat yourself with self-love and self-compassion. You have to give that to yourself and understand that you're not broken, sick, wrong, whatever, for having this stuff in your shadow. This is part of the human process. How can you look at these things that you've hidden away because you felt they're shameful and give yourself love and compassion for them? You can start by understanding that everybody has the same kind of stuff. It's, we're individuals. We have individual items that are in our shadow, individual desires, individual wounds, that sort of thing. But the material is all the same. This is a universal with everyone. And you're doing your work, right? You should feel really good about doing your work. Some time ago, this is, some personal information, but, one of the things that I would counsel couples in doing is talking to each other with complete openness and allowing the person to be who they are and do what they do, and without shame and without judgment, even if what they want is not something that can happen inside that relationship. So, a question I asked my partner one time was, what fantasies do you have that you haven't shared with me, even if it's something that you would never do, right, for whatever reason, or something that that I would not be a party to. And I won't tell you what they are. That's private. But that sort of openness with us, this and this and this. And then she asked, well, how about you? And then said, well, this and this and this. And was really interesting, and just holding loving space for that, right? Without judgment, without criticism, without trying to shame the other person. How could you? Why would you want that? Are you sick? All of those things, those judgment, that shame laying, that pushes things deeper into the shadow. So this has been a short video about how to do shadow work on yourself, and this is how you can get started on doing this work. This work alone will take you very, very far. I will do other videos on self shadow work. I will do another video. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. You can also join this channel as a member now, and you'll get some members only videos and some other perks. So with that said, I will leave you for now, and we'll talk really soon. Take care.